It's a great pleasure to be here. First, on behalf as an employee of the New York Times, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm hoping you guys will find metrics to remind my employers how important the columnists are to the future of the enterprise. And second, as a consumer of social science, I once wrote in a column that a day without social science is like a day without sunshine. And what you guys do is catnip for people like me. Now, I've been asked to speak about tools for thinking. And I'll start with the false model we have in our head about how we think. We have a sense of ourselves as we've got this little voice in our head. It's the voice of reason. It's sort of like a computer. You can measure its strength by using IQ. And the voice of reason sort of tells us what to do. And we prosper to the extent that reason sort of dominates the emotions and the passions. And we use our reason to make all our smart decisions. And we use our emotions to make our dumb decisions. And this sort of model of how we think predominates our society, from everything to how we think about business, how we measure ourselves, and how we raise kids. If you go to an elementary school at 3 in the afternoon, you'll see kids coming out of the elementary school. They've got these 80-pound backpacks on their backs, so if the wind blows them over, they're sort of like beetles, sort of stuck there on the ground. They get certain cars in an upper middle class suburb will drive up to pick up the kids in the afternoon, and usually it's Saabs and Audis and Volvos, because in certain upscale neighborhoods it's socially acceptable to have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to US foreign policy. And then the creatures will come out in many of these upscale neighborhoods called Uber moms, who are highly successful career women who've taken time off to make sure all their kids get into Harvard. And you can usually tell the Uber mom because they actually weigh less than their own children. They don't really have thighs, they just have one elegant calf on top of each other. And so the Uber mom is, at the moment of conception, is doing little butt exercises to stay fit and trim. During pregnancy, she's taking so many soy-based nutritional formula that the babies come out, they're like these 13-pound behemoths, sort of toothless defensive linemen, plopping out there in the delivery room. The Uber mom is cutting the umbilical cord herself, adjusting the video lighting, flashing little Mandarin flashcards at the things to make sure it can get into Harvard. Then on the way home, they take it off to Ben & Jerry's ice cream, so it'll have some socially enlightened ice cream, and so it'll be environmentally sensitive as it grows up. I once made a joke in one of my books that Ben & Jerry's should make a pacifist toothpaste. Doesn't kill germs, just ask them to leave. It'd be a big seller. And then they want to get some sort of socially enlightened baby formula, so they take it to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, one of these progressive grocery stores where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. And they go to the snack food section, which is my favorite section, because they couldn't just have pretzels and potato chips, because that would be vulgar, lead to the obesity of America. So they have these seaweed-based snacks. In my household, we get a snack called Veggie Booty with kale. Which is for kids who come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colon rectal cancer. And so they raise the kids in a certain way, sort of the Tiger Mom way, which is making sure they get straight A's, making sure they do well in their SAT scores. And this is the sort of child rearing that produces sort of the junior workaholics of America, which we have around us, which emphasizes these conscious skills. These things can be measured in grades and measured in SAT scores. But we're sort of in the middle of a cognitive revolution, giving us a new understanding of how we think and what tools are really the most important tools for thinking. And this cognitive revolution is taking place in fields like neuroscience, cognitive sciences, behavioral economics, sociology, psychology. And it's really giving us a different view of actually how we think and what tools are useful as we make decisions. And this revolution is more or less based on 3 key foundational insights. The first insight is that while the conscious mind writes the autobiography of our species, the unconscious mind does most of the work. So the human mind can take in about 12 million pieces of information a minute, of which you can be consciously aware of 40. All the rest is happening unconsciously. And some of these decisions are odd. One of my favorite bits of research is that people named Dennis are disproportionately likely to become dentists. People named Lawrence are disproportionately likely to become lawyers, because we unconsciously bias toward things that are familiar, which is why my daughter is named President of the United States Brooks. Another unconscious pattern is that if you eat alone, you eat about this much. If you eat with one other person, you'll eat on average 35% more. If you eat with 3 other people, you'll eat on average 78% more. And this is just sort of an unconscious bias. But much of the unconscious thinking is peculiar, but much of it is quite intelligent. And one of the neuroscientists gave me a good tip. If you have trouble making up your mind about something, tell yourself you'll solve it by a coin flip. And flip a coin, but then don't go by how it comes up, whether it comes up heads or tails. Go by your emotional reaction to the coin flip. Are you happy or sad it went up heads or tails? And that's really your inner mind telling you what you actually want. So that's the first foundational principle, which is the power of unconscious thinking for good and for bad. The second insight is that emotion is not separate from reason, but emotion is the foundation of reason. People who suffer strokes and lesions that make it impossible for them to process emotion are not super smart Mr. Spocks, they're super dumb. Because what our emotions do is tells us what we value. They assign value to things. And if you don't have the procedure to help you assign value, you really can't make a decision properly. And now I'm a middle-aged man. I'm not particularly comfortable talking about emotions. My wife jokes that me talking about emotions is like Gandhi talking about gluttony. It's not my natural thing. But emotions actually are central to how we think. They're central to how we assign value. They're central to what we remember. We remember things that are emotional. And they're central to actually wiring the fibers of the brain together. In 1945, there were orphanages in Nevada where they took kids and they decided they would give them food and they would give them health care, but they wouldn't touch them because they wanted to keep them antiseptic, germ-free. And the mortality rate by age 2 in these orphanages was 38%. They stopped naming the kids because they were dying at such high rates. It is the tender touch, the emotion, that literally wires the fibers of the brain together. So the second foundational principle is the centrality of emotion to all rational thinking, because it assigns value to things. The third is that we're not primarily self-contained individuals. We are deeply interpenetrated with one another. We have these things in our head called mirror neurons, which we don't simply observe each other, we copy in our own minds what we see other people doing. And so if I pick up a glass, you in your brain, it will look like you yourself are picking up the glass. And so we're deeply interpenetrated with one another, one, just by what we see, second, by things we're vaguely even aware of, such as sense of smell. We don't even think about smell particularly, but it's one of the most important faculties we use to think about each other. People who lose the sense of smell suffer greater emotional deterioration than people who lose any other sense. And we figure each other out using this sense, for example. In Germany, they did a bit of research where they took gauze pads, taped it under people's arms, and then had some of the people watch a horror movie, some watch a comedy, and then they had other research subjects, presumably well paid, sniff the gauze pads. And they could tell at way above average which movie the people watched just by sniffing the gauze pad. And women, by the way, were a lot better than men. And so these three foundational principles, the power of unconscious thinking, the power of emotion and the centrality to reason, and the deep interpenetration of our minds, gives us a different story of who we are, not these rational creatures, but really emotional and social creatures. And when you begin to look at human nature through this prism, you begin to see a different set of skills. IQ is important. IQ explains about 25% of the variation in job performance. But 75% of the variation in job performance is shaped by other things, by other traits and other tools. And I'm just going to go down a list of some of the other traits that are actually fundamentally important in how we think and whether we're going to do well or not. The first trait is what you might call mindsight, the ability to look into other people's minds and to download what they have to offer. Now, babies come equipped with this trait. Alan Meltzoff, a scientist in 1979, leaned over a baby who was 43 minutes old and wagged his tongue at the baby. And the baby wagged her tongue back at 43 minutes old. She didn't know what a face was, what a tongue was, but she was equipped to mimic. And this ability to mimic is a tremendously powerful tool to how we do in life. In this country, at 18 months, 55% of the babies have what they call secure attachments. They have a two-way communication system with mom. And scientists can take a look at that attachment pattern at 18 months, and they can predict with 77% accuracy who's going to graduate from high school. And that's because if at 18 months you know how to establish a two-way conversation with mom, you not only have that relationship, but you have a model in your head for how to establish relationships. So when you go to school, you will know how to establish relationship with teachers. 20% of the kids are what they call avoidantly attached. They've sent out communications to mom, but for whatever reason, nothing's come back. And those kids do much less well in school. A teacher I met described a kid who was avoidantly attached walking into a classroom like a sailboat tacking into the wind, wanting to get close to teacher, wanting to learn, but not knowing how to do it. And so ended up with his back to teacher. And avoidantly attached kids have less activation in the reward areas of their brain during social interaction. At age 70, they're going to have 2/3 fewer friends. Now, nothing that happens at 18 months determines a life course, but it opens up a pathway which can be either confirmed or deconfirmed by later experience. And some people have this ability, when you meet them, they laser in on you and they're going to download every piece of information they have because they have tremendous facility to open up two-way communication systems. The second trait is equipoise. And this is the ability to look inside your own mind and see what weaknesses you have there. So for example, we have a tremendous ability as a species to be overconfident about ourselves. 96% of college professors believe they have above average teaching skills. Time magazine recently asked Americans, are you in the top 1% of earners? 19% of Americans are in the top 1% of earners. Paul Schumacher and Edward Russo gave executives tests about their own industries. And then they asked them, how confident are you got the answers to these tests correct? People in the advertising industry gave answers they thought were 90% correct. In fact, they got 60% of the answers wrong. The most overconfident industry was the computer industry. Executives in that industry thought they got the answers 95% correct. In fact, they got the answers 80% wrong. We all have a tendency to be overconfident, and this is a heavily gender-linked trait. Men drown at twice the rate as women because men have tremendous confidence in their ability to swim after they've been drinking. But some people have the ability to be aware of that inner weakness. They have what you call epistemological modesty. And so they're open-minded in the face of ambiguity. They adjust the strength of their conclusion to the strength of the evidence. They're modest in the face of partial knowledge. And they construct bootstraps for themselves, modesty bootstraps. Peter Drucker had one. He said, when you make a decision, write down your reasoning, seal it in an envelope for 9 months, open the envelope later. And you'll find that 1/3 of your decisions were right, 1/3 were wrong, 1/3 were in the middle, but in almost all cases, your reasoning was entirely irrelevant. And so that's the way you construct bootstraps for yourself to create this trait equipoise. The third trait is metis. This is to be sensitive to the physical environment around you. The New York Times did a great story several months ago about soldiers in Iraq, some of whom could look down a street in Baghdad and tell whether there was an IED in that street. And they could tell you, yes, there's a landmine down in that street. And you asked them, how do you know? They couldn't tell you. They just said they felt a coldness inside. And from close observation, some people develop the ability to scan reality and detect when something is right and wrong, to pull out the essential patterns. And this is not an inborn trait. It comes from close observation and long experience. So in one experiment, they took chess grandmasters and chess novices and gave them 5 seconds to memorize a chessboard. The novices could memorize maybe 4 or 5 pieces on the board. The chess grandmasters could memorize every single piece on the board in 5 seconds. And that's because they didn't see individual pieces. They saw formations of pieces. They read the chessboard differently than the novices because of their long experience. When they moved the chess pieces around so they were in positions that could never actually happen in a chess game, the grandmasters were no better than anybody else. And so it's by long experience and close observation you develop this unconscious ability to pick out the patterns in the world. The fourth trait is the trait of sympathy, which is the ability to be sensitive to a social environment, sensitive to people around you. This comes in handy because most of us work in groups. We work in groups because groups are smarter than individuals. We work harder when we're in groups. Somebody had the bright idea at the Olympics of looking at the swim times of swimmers when they were in individual events versus the swim times of swimmers when they were in relay teams. People swam much faster and had better times as members of a relay team than they did as members of an individual event. And the people who swam the third and fourth leg of the relay team had much, much better times. Because when they feel themselves part of a collective, they perform better, they're motivated better, which is why so many compensation schemes don't reward an individual with performance bonuses. They put people in groups and reward the groups. Now, groups are smarter than individuals, and face-to-face groups are much smarter than groups that communicate electronically. At the University of Michigan, they took a bunch of people, separated them into groups, and gave them math problems. Some of the groups met face-to-face for 10 minutes, and they could solve the math problems without any trouble. Some of the groups had 30 minutes to solve the math problem, but they had to communicate electronically by email. Those groups could not solve the problems. And that's because so much of our communication is by intonation, by gesture, by smell. Face-to-face groups are much smarter and much better than email groups. And the effectiveness of the group, the intelligence of the group, was not related to the IQ of the individual members of the group. It was related to how well they communicated and read each other's emotional signals, how often they took turns in conversation. And some people have this ability to be sensitive emotionally to those around them, and some people don't. And so that's the trait of sympathy. The fifth trait is the trait of propriety. And that is designing a world to maximize self-control. The most famous experiment in all these fields was done by a guy who's now at Columbia here named Walter Mischel, called the marshmallow experiment. And some of you probably know it. Mischel, years ago, took 4-year-olds, put them in a room, put the marshmallow in front of them on a table, and said to these 4-year-olds, you can eat this marshmallow now, but I'm going to come back in 10 minutes. If you haven't eaten the marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And Mischel shows me the videos of these 4-year-old kids trying not to eat the marshmallow. There's a little girl banging her head on the table. Some little guys, they take the marshmallow and sort of shove it up their nostrils to smell it without eating it. One little guy, one day, Mischel was using an Oreo cookie. Little guy carefully picks up the Oreo, carefully eats out the middle, and carefully puts it back on the table. That kid is now a U.S. congressman from Queens. No, just, just kidding. But the important thing was that the kids who could wait 8, 9, 10 minutes before eating the marshmallow, or 15, 20 years later had much higher college completion rates, and 30 years later, much higher incomes. The kids who could only wait 1 minute had much higher drug and alcohol addiction problems and much higher incarceration rates. And that's because some kids grew up in homes where they developed strategies to control their impulses. And if you could do that, school will be fine. If you can't do that, school will be frustrating. And so this power of self-control to structure your world, they didn't do it by exercising iron willpower. What they did was they pretended the marshmallow was something else. They distracted themselves from the marshmallow. And so what people do is they structure their world with habits in order to control their mind. And the power to shift your attention from one thing to another is the essential trait we have, the way we control ourselves, the power of attention. And so to build up character, what you don't do is say, I will stare at a temptation and I will just say no using my iron willpower. You develop strategies to shift your attention to something else. You develop habits where you practice small acts of self-control, and then you literally are grooving your mind so when the big temptations come along, you're protected from those things. The sixth trait is blending. And this is the ability, which is really the core of creativity. Creativity comes when you take 2 different idea spaces, idea networks, and you jam them together like 2 galaxies clashing in space. And so this is something we're phenomenally good at. If you asked a computer to say, I'm a tiger, what does that mean? There's no computer on earth that could come close to putting these 2 complicated things, I and tiger, and jamming them together. But any child can do that and pretend to be a tiger. And this is what leads to innovation. Picasso took 2 concepts, Western art, African masks, and he blended them together. And that was the core of his creativity. And some people have this ability to blend two different concepts together. And so in many ways, these are some of the traits that lead to success. And in many ways, they rely on smart, unconscious processes. But in many ways, our unconscious processes are not that smart, and they lead us astray. And so as scientists have begun to understand the way our unconscious helps us and the traits that are really important to our success, they've also developed things we should be aware of to correct for the weaknesses of our unconscious thinking. And recently there was a symposium by something called edge.org, which took a group of neuroscientists and said, what sort of tools would you need to compensate for the weaknesses of your unconscious? What tools should be in your cognitive toolkit? And I wrote about it, and I'm going to mention a few that they mention and a couple that seem important to me. And these are things that should be in your cognitive toolkit to correct from the biases and the weaknesses in our own thinking. And so one concept they came up with is the concept of path dependence. And this says that things that seem normal to us actually began long ago with a conscious choice which may not be relevant anymore. So the classic example of this is the typewriter or the keyboard. When the first typewriters were built, they jammed if somebody typed too fast. So they developed a keyboard that would maximize inefficiency by making the pinky more important than it really should be. And yet we are now stuck with the QWERTY keyboard because we all got used to that keyboard. But it was made by a conscious choice to maximize inefficiency, and now we're stuck with it. So that is an example of path dependence, something that happened for a long time that we now assume to be inevitable, but which was not inevitable. The second is the Einstellung effect. This is the illusion that what worked in the past will work in the current situation. Our tendency to make extremely simplistic metaphors to describe the situation we're now in. In foreign policy, a powerful one is Munich. We appeased Hitler in Munich in the 1930s, therefore we apply the metaphor of Munich to every single foreign policy problem. Another one is Vietnam. Vietnam was a quagmire, then every war we enter, we think of Vietnam. And this is the power of controlling metaphors. The third is the focusing illusion, which is a very important one, which holds that nothing in life is as important as it seems when you're thinking about it. The things we focus on seem to be more important than they really are simply because we are focusing on them. And so an example of this is when we think about how you're going to do in life and inequality in this country, we focus a lot on education. And education is really important to determining your future income and to inequality in the country. Yet if every single person in the country had the same education level, that would reduce inequality by less than 10%. That is to say, education is very important, but it's not super important. There are a million other things that explain that other 91% to inequality. And so the focusing illusion, we focus our spotlight on things that really that we should focus on, but we shouldn't forget that the things outside the spotlight are also tremendously important. Another one is the fundamental attribution error. And this is a favorite one for psychologists. And that says, don't try to explain by traits things that are really determined by context. We are very quick to think somebody has a trait. They're courageous, they're honest. In fact, very few of us have traits that pertain across all situations. People who are honest at school are sometimes dishonest in the playground. People who are brave on the battlefield are sometimes not brave at a public speaking platform. Context is generally more important than traits, but we are very quick to assign other people with traits and assume those traits are permanent to them all the time. So when we cut in line at the grocery store checkout, we think, well, I got to do this, I'm in a real hurry. When we see somebody else cut in line, we think, what an asshole. So we think, to us, it's context. When it's somebody else, it's a trait. And this assigning of trait is something you have to be extremely cautious about. Another mental toolkit is the distinction between emotion and arousal. We tend to think of emotion as somebody who's screaming a lot or is crying a lot. That's arousal. Emotion, Emily Dickinson, the poet, was a tremendously emotionally sensitive person. and yet she was not going around screaming all the time. And so we should be aware that when we're reading a situation, subtly assigning value to things, that's being emotionally aware. It doesn't mean you're crying all the time. Another fundamental piece in the toolkit, it was the philosopher Karl Popper. He made a distinction between problems that are clocks and problems that are clouds. A clock is something you can take apart, a problem that you can take apart and look at each of its constituent pieces and then figure out that way. That's a clock problem. A cloud problem, you can't take it apart. It's a dynamic system. And we have a tendency, because we're very comfortable solving clock problems, we try to turn all cloud problems into clock problems by taking them apart. But cloud problems are characterized by this concept, emergence, and this is one of the hottest fields in this whole research. An emergent system is a cloud. So an emergent system is a lot of things coming together and through the pattern of their interaction creating a new thing. So for example, American culture is an emergent system. None of us are actually perfect embodiments of American culture if we're Americans, or Chinese culture, or whatever culture, and yet by our pattern of interaction, we create this thing called American culture, which then has an influence on how we behave, or whatever nationality you come from. A marriage is an emergent system. The pattern of behavior between a husband and a wife create certain patterns of interaction, and once those patterns of interaction get established, then they create an influence on how people behave. There's a marriage counselor in New York named Francine Klagsbrun who says, when people come into my counseling office, there are three characters. There's the husband, there's the wife, and there's the marriage. The marriage is the emergent system, the pattern of interaction on top of that. And so it's tremendously important to understand that emergent systems are not clocks and to analyze them holistically. A couple more, the Pareto principle. We have this bias in our minds to think everything is a bell-shaped curve. That if we look at any distribution of people or of skills, we tend to think the hump is in the middle. Most people fall in the middle. And yet in most cases, that's not true. And the Pareto principle tells us that the most important people often fall on the end of the distribution. So the top 1% of the population control 35% of the wealth. The top 2% of Twitter users send 60% of the Twitter messages. In any workplace, the top 20% of the workers usually contribute the bulk of the productivity. So it's the people on the top end of the distribution that actually often matters most, not the people in the middle. Then there's the concept of subselves. We tend to think that we are a unified person. There's one creature in there which is acting more or less consistently through life. Most of the research doesn't support this. It supports the idea that we have very many different authentic personalities, all of which come into being and are aroused by contexts. So some of us may have a brave personality in one context, a happy personality in another, a daring personality in another, a relatively risk-averse personality in another. And these different subselves are aroused by different contexts, and that we're not just one creature. And so these are some of the traits. I'll just mention two more. The first is the distinction between askers and guessers. And this is more or less a funny one, but I think it's illuminating when we think about people. Some people are askers. When they want to stay at your house for a weekend, they'll just ask. And if you say no, they're not bothered. But they'll go through life asking, asking, asking. Other people are guessers. If they asked and you said no, they would feel mortified. And therefore, they never actually ask. And so they'll maneuver the situation hoping to get an invitation to your house for the weekend, but they'll never actually ask. And so when you get a relationship between an asker and a guesser, you're bound to have problems. And all of self-help is designed to take guessers and turn them into askers. I found that distinction sort of useful as I think about my friends. And then the final trait, and this to me is the core trait that motivates us, is a trait which I'll call limerence. When we think about what the conscious mind wants, it's money, success, and status. But what the unconscious mind wants is those moments of transcendence when the self-awareness falls away. When a craftsman is lost in the craft, when an athlete is lost in a sport, when the naturalist feels at one with nature, when a believer feels lost in God's love, and when we feel lost in the love for one another. And this, to me, is the fundamental drive. This, to me, is what we're all looking for. Those moments when we're not aware of ourselves. The conscious mind just disappears. And if you can offer people that, the moment of self-forgetting, then you're really offering them something tremendously profound that they will gravitate toward. Thank you very much.